I'm just going to come out and say it. The remake of Resident Evil 2 is not only one of the best Resident Evil experiences, but it more clearly defines the word remake. The game combines all the best parts of the franchise. It takes the story and setting of RE2, adds in the gameplay approach of REs 4 through 6, and all running on RE7's engine. In my opinion, this game is an early contender for Game of the Year. It's that good. What makes this game so special isn't that it's a remake of a game that was released 21 years ago, but it was truly recreated from the ground up. It feels like a brand new yet familiar game. Fans of the original will recognize classic moments and characters, but will also experience new things like different puzzles and whatnot. But I don't want to make this sound like it's a review. No, we're talking about how this particular remake impacts the industry as a whole. When they first announced that they were going to be doing a remake for Resident Evil 2, I assumed that they would have given it the same treatment that the remake for Resident Evil 1 received back in '02. Resident Evils 1 through 3 all used the fixed camera angles that a lot of games in the 90s featured. When the first game received the remake, it kept that and the core gameplay. It just overhauled the graphics and re-recorded the dialogue and sound to give the game a more modernized feel, but it was still the exact same game more or less. Until now, most remakes were exactly what the remake for Resident Evil 1 was. More recently, games like Crash Bandicoot and Spyro saw similar touch-ups. It wasn't that people were expecting more, it was just widely accepted that this is what remakes were. They usually redo the sound and visuals but keep the core gameplay mechanics the same. Resident Evil 2, however, decided to go a step further by not only modernizing the graphics and sound, but also by taking a risk and changing the core mechanics of the original game. Now you might be asking yourself, why is removing fixed camera angles a risk? They're grossly outdated for a remake in 2019. Now that might be true, but you have to really consider exactly what the fixed camera angles did. The Resident Evil franchise at its best is a survival horror franchise. I say at its best because at its worst it goes more actiony. That's a topic for another time maybe. But the word to focus on here is horror. Fixed camera angles weren't just a limit for game development at the time, it added to that horror aspect. You only saw what the developers wanted you to see. Going from one screen to the next meant that you might be walking into a situation that you did not expect. Yeah, you thought you cleared the room of zombies, but when you turn the corner and realize that you actually have more to deal with, it can add to the suspense. Some people might be of the opinion that by removing the fixed camera angles, you remove the suspense that they add. You can't recreate the exact same game with the same enemy placements and puzzles because the game plays differently now. If you remove something, you need to add on a replacement that fits properly. In the case of the remake for Resident Evil 2, the game made hallways and corridors narrow and dark. The player is forced to tackle situations within these dark and narrow hallways that sometimes make it impossible to dodge enemies. In my opinion, the game adds to the suspense in this way better than whatever the fixed camera angles would have done. There were multiple times when I reached a hallway with enemies and I would either need to spend precious ammo to eliminate the threat or find another way. Sometimes the way back gets blocked by zombies that I thought I beat earlier, but they decided to get back up again. It sounds annoying in theory, but in reality, it's an incredibly immersive and tense experience. It's everything that you would want from a survival horror title. Again, it sounds like I'm reviewing the game, but I just want to lay out the examples of what this game does right. Like I said before, it doesn't just redo the graphics and sound, it took a risk by also redoing the core gameplay. They decided not to play it safe and created something that not only is a good replacement for the fixed cameras, but also something better. It's a phenomenal work of game development. Here's the thing, we now live in a post-Resident Evil 2 remake world, so how do future remakes respond? Looking specifically at Final Fantasy VII's remake, which may or may not still be happening, does the game decide to play it safe, or does it take the RE2 risk and rebuild the game with new gameplay elements? So for those not familiar, me being one of them because I never played Final Fantasy VII, the game is a typical JRPG. You got the fixed camera angles for navigating the world, dialogue delivered through text boxes, the same blocky look a lot of older games tend to have, and also a turn-based combat system. Looking at the trailer that was released, holy shit, is that 3 years ago? Are we sure that this game is still happening? Hell, now I'm starting to think that maybe Capcom got the total remake idea for Resident Evil 2 from this trailer. But looking at the trailer, it shows off that the game is going to be getting that complete recreation. The fixed camera angles are gone as you see the player running in the usual third-person view, but not only that, it appears that the combat is going to be replaced with something more fitting of a Final Fantasy game that would be released today. What's interesting is that it looks like you'll be able to switch between different characters while in combat like you could for the original. Being a game with the turn-based combat system, the game would cycle between all characters on the field for you to individually give directions to. Not only the main character, but the other party members as well. So the idea of being able to switch between other party members in the remake during combat situations seems like a natural choice. It does make me wonder if it will maybe play at all like the Dragon Age series. In Dragon Age, you would have the main playable character, but also the other party members, and whoever you had with you, you could directly take control of. Although you would only make dialogue decisions for the main character, you could still take control of each character in your party during combat situations. If this is the direction that Final Fantasy VII decides to go with, it would be a perfect fit for a game that was once entirely turn-based, but is now a bit more involved. Of course, there is a risk-taking factor involved here. Being a person that has never played the original game, I can't sit here and say that removing the turn-based combat is a risk worth taking. Personally, I don't like that approach to combat and feel that, like fixed camera angles, it's outdated for modern gaming. That being said, maybe the best thing about Final Fantasy VII is the combat, and taking it out would make the game significantly less enjoyable. And that's at the heart of every video game, the fun factor. If a game is not fun to play, then you're not going to spend any time playing it. As much as I love story in games and am a big supporter of the single-player experience, gameplay is still important. Games like the most recent God of War, for example, have a story that is more subtle and on a much smaller scale, but the gameplay is phenomenal and makes you feel like Thor from the Marvel movies. That's not to say that the story in God of War is bad, it just decided to take a back seat to the gameplay. That's where the developers put their focus, rather than putting a big, epic, fantastical story. And then you have games like Dead Space that have a very simple task of repair the ship and escape, but the atmosphere of the Ishimura and the mechanics of fighting against the necromorphs make it so enjoyable. The point is that if your game's mechanics and controls suck, people aren't going to waste their time, regardless of if the game is a remake of a classic title. You have to appreciate the effort here. Square Enix is taking a risk on attempting to innovate on something that's beloved by many. They could have easily have just redone the graphics and sound and keep the turn-based combat the same, but instead they're deciding to create something new yet familiar, just like what Capcom did with Resident Evil 2. The only thing is that, like I mentioned before, if you replace something, it needs to be as good or better than what came before. Your game will fail if it's anything else. If done well, you'll be improving on what many consider one of the best video games of all time. That's assuming the remake is still happening, because it has been very quiet on that front for a while. Looking more toward other games, is there anything else that could benefit from this style of a remake? What about Legend of Dragoon? Legend of Dragoon is one of my favorite video games of all time. Like Final Fantasy VII, the game is a JRPG complete with all the same things. Blocky characters, text boxes, turn-based combat, blah 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 blah. But giving this game the remake treatment would be something that I personally would love very much, especially since the game's story is so good and the world with its lore is awesome. Rumors of a port of Dragoon to current-gen consoles, or rather a remake, have floated around for years, but nothing ever really happened. It was available for purchase on the PS3, but not for the PS4. Believe me, I've checked. Similar to Final Fantasy VII, the risk-taking here is in replacing the turn-based combat. I love the idea of seeing those Dragoon transformations and designs in a remake, but we also talk about this idea of remakes making improvements on the original. One of the more popular critiques of Dragoon was that the transformations didn't seem very useful. They came off as gimmicky and fancy, but didn't exactly impact the gameplay as a whole. So maybe the remake could change that a bit. If it happens, of course. It probably won't, but one can dream. What about Castlevania Symphony of the Night? Now, this game is a bit interesting because unlike any of the other games that we've previously talked about, this game is a 2D side-scroller. There are two options here. You can play it safe and just up the graphics and maybe add in some real cinematics for the story, but the other option would be, again, the RE2 approach. That would mean recreating a 2D game to occupy a 3D space. But you would also need to faithfully recreate what makes this game so special, and that's something that might be difficult to do. The Castlevania and Metroid series are both what are considered Metroidvania games, an approach to gaming that is all about backtracking and gaining new abilities that allow you to access new areas. More successful Metroidvania games are typically 2D side-scrollers. Games in a 3D environment tend to struggle with recreating the same gameplay focus. Not only that, but taking a 2D world and laying it out in a 3D space might also present some challenges. This is of course that risk-taking that we talked about earlier. Still, if successfully pulled off, this could be one of those greater games to recreate, especially when the castle flips and you have to work your way through it again. Seeing a 3D remake pull that off would be impressive. We also, of course, can talk about the other games in the Resident Evil franchise, especially since Capcom likes remaking their old titles. It's probably a safe bet to assume that we will eventually get a remake for Resident Evil 3, and definitely with the same style that the previous remake saw. But what about the first Resident Evil? Yeah, I know it saw the remake in 2002, but what about giving it the RE2 treatment? I would totally be on board for that. If it is on the to-do list at Capcom, it's likely a very low priority. My guess would be that it could be something that they get to after the remake of 3 and after the release of Resident Evil 8. So that's the other thing. We can't get too distracted in creating remakes of older games that we forget about making the new things. As much as I would love to play the remake of Resident Evil 3 or 1 or 4 or Code Veronica or whatever, I still want to eventually play a new chapter in the franchise. The industry gets pretty stale when all anyone does is creates new versions of older games. I like the trend right now, but we can't stay in it forever. The reality is this, the remake of Resident Evil 2 has changed the game. The industry as a whole now has to look at remakes a little differently. There is now a risk-taking factor that totally doesn't have to be taken, but Capcom has just proven that taking that risk could be worth it. Now the question is, will future remakes follow this example, or will they continue to play it safe? We likely won't start seeing remakes like this for a while since it takes a bit for games to be made, and Resident Evil 2 only came out last month. It'll be at least a couple of years before we start seeing similar remakes, if at all. But what do you think? What are some games that you would like to see be given the remake treatment? Let me know in the comments, and as always, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.